When this dog refused to let a baby sleep alone, its parents were concerned. After finding out the reason, they called the cops straight away, and the truth that unraveled was horrifying. Arriving on the scene, Officer Bentley had no idea what he was walking into. The 911 dispatcher told him that a woman was screaming for the police to come. There was something to do with her baby and her dog, but it was difficult to make out over the sobbing. Bentley slowed his police cruiser to a standstill, glancing at his young partner to make sure he was ready. Still in his rookie year, Bentley was showing him how to handle real-life scenarios. And this house was going to be his big break, only he didn't know it yet. They had barely reached the door before it swung open, and a woman motioned for them to come inside. Peeking around the house, everything looked to be in order. But as the lady began to explain the situation, it was clear that nothing was quite as it seemed. She introduced herself as Jessie. Together with her husband David, they were new parents, having just given birth to a baby girl. Bentley looked at his partner, locking their gaze and acknowledging to each other they knew exactly what was happening, and why this baby was in serious danger. The parents told them they had both worried about the reaction of their black pit bull Benji when Jessie fell pregnant, and for good reason. Early on in the pregnancy, Benji had barked at Jessie anytime she rubbed her stomach or talked to the baby. Benji had always been jealous of other dogs and was especially fiercely protective of David. Now, the new couple worried that he could be a danger to the baby. David had adopted Benji years ago, before he even met Jessie. Once they started dating, Jessie had been apprehensive. But once she fell pregnant and the two quickly got married, David was able to convince Jessie that Benji wasn't a threat. Despite never acting aggressively, Benji could never earn Jessie's trust. She refused to play with him, pat him, and banned him from entering the bedroom. David understood his wife's hesitation, but he had hoped that as the months went by, things would change. And when they didn't, his heart sank a little. He was holding on for the birth of their daughter, thinking that maybe after Benji showed affection to the baby, Jessie would be relieved. But the opposite happened. A few days after arriving back from the hospital, Benji began acting strange. He would bark whenever either of them had their daughter in their arms, and he would only stop when the baby was back in her crib. That wasn't all either. After leaving their daughter with their new babysitter Anne, something kept recurring. Anne told them that Benji wouldn't allow Lily to sleep alone. Benji would either sneak into the baby's room whenever the door was open, and if it were closed, Anne noticed that she couldn't find Benji anywhere until she looked in the front yard. Incredibly, the dog had jumped the side fence from the backyard to the front of the house and would be sitting right next to the baby's window, out towards the street. This usually happy dog would have a look of concentration on its face. Its tongue was glued inside its mouth instead of wagging out the side as it so often was. Once, Anne watched Benji for almost an hour, and he refused to move. But what was he doing? When Jessie told her mother, her first suspicion was Anne. Even though Anne had been a childhood friend of Jessie's, her mother had never totally agreed with the friendship. She suspected that Anne was a bad influence. And Anne was the dangerous and untrustworthy one, a reputation she couldn't seem to live down. David and Jessie were determined to get to the bottom of their dog's strange behavior. They watched over the canine in the following weeks, and they too noticed that he wouldn't leave the baby's side, not even for a minute. Especially when the baby was in her room, Benji was on high alert. After taking the dog to the local vet, they learned that nothing was wrong with it. And it was the same story at the pediatrician's. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with the baby either. But they were looking in the wrong place, and they were on the brink of discovering the precise location they should have been focusing on all along. David decided to take matters into his own hands. His day job was as a computer salesman, and at his workplace they sold surveillance systems. It took less than a couple of hours to set up a few cameras in the house, especially in the baby's room. By this point, his wife was growing increasingly concerned by Benji's behavior. She had been apprehensive already, and now, with this strange behavior, she was even less convinced that Benji was safe to be around. Her friends and family had warned her about pit bulls, and she should have listened. Even when she locked the baby's bedroom door, Benji always seemed to find a way in. Just as Anne had seen, Benji would jump fences to sit near their daughter's room. The dog's apparent obsession with the newborn raised concerns for Jessie regarding the safety of them all. David knew the only way to clear Benji's name was with the cameras. And so, when he passed off their daughter to Anne one morning, he turned on the surveillance system and eagerly awaited to watch the footage. Throughout his workday, he was tapping his feet, spinning his pen. Usually, David was a disciplined employee, never leaving before the stroke of 5 p.m. But for the first time, he tumbled out of the back door minutes before his workday was officially over, jumping into his station wagon and speeding away. He was nervous about what he might see, and of course, excited at the possibility of repairing Jesse and Benji's relationship. When he began scrolling through the tape, everything appeared normal. He skipped through the footage at 4 times the speed at first and failed to see anything. He repeated the same thing at double speed. And after failing to see anything again, he began watching it at regular speed. 2 hours later, Jesse arrived home and joined him. Nothing suspicious. Their daughter had barely moved from her cot. Anne was perfectly disciplined and attentive, returning to the cot every 10 minutes or so, making sure their baby was safe. So far, so good. But Benji was still sitting near the baby's cot, looking outwards towards the window. The outside of the window was just out of the camera's frame. Still, there didn't seem to be anything there. No shadow, no sign of movement, and no response from Benji either, apart from the staring, of course. David and Jesse looked at each other with confusion. They were back to the drawing board. And over the next week, David continued to pore over the footage, despite having no success. After the 4th day, Jesse told him to give it a rest, but he refused. As directed, Anne began closing the window and shutting the curtains, just in case. And on the 6th day, David found something that shocked him to his core. It began with a shadow, so faint that he almost missed it. But the dark silhouette on the ground moved fluidly across the window frame, piercing through the thin curtains. His face was so close to the window that David could clearly discern his features by zooming in. It was a middle-aged man, and he was trying to remain incognito. But as soon as the shadow emerged, Benji erupted, barking, baring his teeth, and shaking his head in between yells. Soon, Anne came rushing into the room. By that time, though, it was too late. The man was long gone, having fled as soon as Benji began barking. David sat on the edge of his office chair, his eyes glued wide to the screen. He waited for Jesse to come home before calling the police, who sent over Officer Bentley and his rookie partner to review the footage. A tall, strong man with biceps the size of tree trunks, Bentley had been in the military before joining the force. He was straight to the point, wanting to assure them that he would do his best to keep their daughter safe. But he also had an unusual proposal for them. He first told them they would look into it, and let slip that it was pretty certain who the man was. Without wanting to alarm them, Bentley broached the idea that it was probably a kidnapper who traveled to different parts of the city, taking babies and holding them for ransom to the parents. David and Jesse were horrified. The idea that their baby was that close to danger was gut-wrenching. It made them both shiver, an uneasy feeling washing over them, a mixture between guilt, shame, and violation. It didn't take long for the police department to confirm their suspicions. The police had a number of descriptions from different households, including several grainy images from nanny cams. But they were still unable to identify him. That's why Bentley proposed that they wait for the man to come back and pounce on him. Actually, it was his partner's idea. Jessie was totally against it. She wanted to move Lily to her mother's, where she would be in an apartment block, high up away from the street. But Officer Bentley kept pleading. David was against the idea. But eventually, they were convinced. The police would set up a team for 24-hour surveillance, and since they didn't know when the man would come back, David and Jesse would be called as soon as there was any news. The one relief was that Anne was completely cleared. David and Jesse apologized to her for ever suspecting anything, but she was very understanding. When it comes to your child, she said, there is no rationality. Anne even received a half-hearted apology from Jesse's mother. Anne took the opportunity to tell the family that she would continue to do everything she could to protect Lily, especially while the police were using her as part of a sting operation. It was the most anxious 2 weeks of their entire lives. No longer was David tapping his pen. He didn't need to drink coffee anymore, and he barely slept. Now, he was breaking into sweats in the middle of his shift, driving back to the house, just a few minutes away, during his lunch breaks just to check on his daughter. Each time he arrived, though, frantically opening the front door with his jiggling keys, he would burst into the baby's room to find Lily sleeping peacefully. The police weren't happy with this. They thought it might interfere with the operation. But they knew that saying anything would risk the family pulling their approval, which was already waning. The parents told the task force that if nothing happened in the next few days, then they would withdraw their support. Then, on the final day, police spotted a suspicious figure moving toward the house. The man had a baseball cap covering most of his face, and he couldn't be clearly identified. 3 different radio units made sure they had a visual on the suspect, recording with video for evidence, and ready to pounce. Although he looked extremely suspicious, the man technically hadn't committed any crime yet. They would need to catch him in the act for any charges to stick. The man moved silently towards the house, his shoulders barely moving, gliding through the air as if he were on roller skates. He seemed calm and composed. It was a hauntingly still posture that invited terror. The police were sitting up in their seats, their squad cars and unmarked vehicles spread out over the block. As soon as the man turned into the family's front yard, one of them called the parents as they had agreed. David was the first to respond, but before even answering, he was running to the parking lot, knowing what the call meant. If he had stopped to listen to Officer Bentley's explanation, he might have waited. But instead, he zoomed through the streets, barely looking around for traffic, dodging in and out between lanes. Around one corner, he nudged his rear wheel on the curb, almost sending his car into a tailspin. All he was hoping was that he would make it in time. And coming from the opposite direction, Jessie was doing the same, her knuckles whitening while gripped to the steering wheel, and her eyes wide open, with no time to blink. Back at the house, the man was prying open the wooden window. He
the metallic object from his pocket and used it to jimmy the window from its ledge. After a couple of wobbles, the window broke open surprisingly easy. Poking his head in, he saw that the room was unattended, not even that pesky dog that had foiled him last time. He threaded his leg inside, followed by the other, ducking his head underneath the window frame. Inside, he checked around him again. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the television coming from the next room, but there was no sign of anyone else. Turning his attention to the cot, he scooped the baby up, already wrapped in a blanket, before hurling himself out of the window, almost tripping over and running off down the street. He'd made it, the man thought, and he already began to imagine how he was going to spend the ransom money from the crime. Last time, he had been paid tens of thousands of dollars in cash. Not if David could help it, though. He was coming from the opposite side of the street and screeched to a halt in his car to chase the man who he immediately identified as the criminal. The man had doubled back the other way, but in a moment of chaos, David and Jessie collided in their separate cars, leaving them far behind the kidnapper. By now, the police were in tow behind them. Jessie screamed a blood-curdling noise, the sound of a mother who'd lost their child. She pointed and shrieked at the running man, praying that someone, anyone, would stop him. Just then, from behind her, as if from nowhere, Benji emerged, his head down towards the ground, stiff and focused, above his lightning-quick feet moving in a blur. He was barreling in the direction of Jessie's finger. At the same time, stepping out into the nature strip from an unmarked car was Bentley, now dressed in a suit. He clambered to the pavement and sprinted after the man, catching up to him quickly and colliding at full force like a football player, at the exact moment that Benji caught the man's ankle in his teeth and tripped him. With Bentley's huge body dropping on top of him, the man's body was crushed. The middle-aged man, completely taken by surprise, fell heavily onto one side, rolling through the grass and coming to a stop. From his arms, a bundle of blankets had fallen a couple of yards away from him, sprawling out as the man collapsed. A group of policemen soon poured over the suspect, yelling at him and pinning him down on the ground despite his struggles. Meanwhile, Benji dashed over to the blanket, poking his nose into the blankets, searching for Lily, tearing them apart gently. To Benji's surprise, she was nowhere to be found. He frantically looked around the ground, returning to the man who was now covered by police. Still, there was no sign of the baby, and once David and Jessie had caught up, they were just as confused. Jessie fell to her knees, unable to understand the situation. The police explained to them that they had begun switching the baby out with the dummy once a week, on a day they knew it was likely for the man to strike. When they made the call, they attempted to inform the parents, but they were unable to do so in time, as both parents dropped their phones and rushed over to the house. Upon hearing that the area was safe, the rookie officer stepped out from the passenger side of a car parked by the road, holding Lily securely in his arms. He was thrilled that his first big operation had gone so smoothly, and a huge smile spread across his face. Anne stepped out of a police car too. She had been tipped off by the police that the man was in the area and retreated to the safety of a car. Jessie ran over to greet her daughter, wrapping her up and soothing her with reassurance. Lily was crying, and so was Jessie. After a family hug, David gave Benji an even bigger hug. He hadn't doubted Benji's loyalty for a moment, and he felt a sense of satisfaction in having his belief in his faithful dog fully justified. Benji had gone above and beyond, protecting their baby and hunting down the danger. From behind, David poked Jessie's shoulder. She sheepishly wandered over to Benji and knelt down to him, hoping that he would accept her apology. After a short pause with Benji's head tilted, he ran in between Jessie's legs, pointing his head up, and licked her face. Jessie had never felt so much love, and she felt even worse for having ever doubted him. But it wasn't long before all was forgotten. Jessie and Benji became closer than ever, to the point where David was becoming jealous. At last, though, they had one big happy family, and their daughter was safe. What an incredible